three horizons. Each one of them has a budget. And the way the budget works is that any carryover money we have going into 2021 is going to be listed there in the opening balance. And really what we're accounting for is the carryover unobligated surface transportation block grant money that is available through that mandatory suballocation. We will have a little bit of carryover balance in the Transportation Alternatives Program, but by and large, it's going to be those two grants that have any sort of opening balance. And so then the revenue column for 2025 is going to be the new revenue that we expect based on that 2% annual growth over the base year, plus the opening balance. So that's what the revenue column means. The planned is a sum of all the projects that have a planned expenditure from that program in the list that I'll show you. And then the balance is what's remaining after you subtract that from the revenue for that horizon year. And then for 2035 and 2045, the only thing I'll say differently is that the revenue columns for each of these include not only the new money that we anticipate for that set of years, but it also includes the opening balance. Sorry, the ending balance from the previous horizon year. So the revenue for the NHPP program for 2035 includes $460 million in remaining balance from 2025, plus the new revenue from that program for the years 2026 through 2035. Okay, I'll come back to this in a bit, and I'll talk about like the exercise that we're going through to balance this out according to each horizon and each grant, and then cumulatively. But this is a live look at the balances according to the list, which is presented on the following pages. Quick note about how this is organized. It's organized to help you make some sense of the process. And so you'll notice in the footer of each page, we couldn't be too wordy down in the footer, obviously, so it's kind of shorthand, but we're basically coding each of the sections by color. So this is there for future reference, but let me go through it at a high level and it'll make more sense to you. And when you go back and read that footer, it'll jog your memory. The projects at the top, which are in the light gray, are those programmatic investments that I mentioned. You'll notice we've got the planning programs and the TAP, that's just the Transportation Alternatives Program, the CMAQ program, HSIP, and then you see the FTA programs there, starting with the Urbanized Area Transit Program on down through bus and bus facilities. So these are programmatic projects, and then if you go over to the right side, you see the planned amount of expenditure by horizon year, which also equals the available revenue per horizon year. So these balance out by virtue of the way we're listing them in the plan. As we go across, what you see here is the 2020 cost estimate, and this is still largely resting for those projects that have a cost estimate, which is not applicable to the programmatic projects. But the 2020 cost estimate is still largely based on the information that you gave us. We're continuing to go through the cost verification process, so some of these numbers may change, which is one of the reasons why this list is going to continue to evolve as we change the cost estimates. It's obviously going to change the expenditures and the balances. But that's what this column is. The federal share, generally speaking, is assumed to be 80% of that total cost. But it's not always the case. There will be exceptions as we go through the list where there will be amounts less than 80%. And that tends to be in the case where the burden on the grant that we're showing is less than 80% of the total cost estimate, either because that project is being split funded across grant programs, or you have an overruns from a local or a state source of revenue. But generally speaking, the federal share is assumed to be 80% of the total project cost, and it's there more as a basis for the numbers that will go into the horizons. The TIP ID is shown if we have linked the project up to the current work program. The tier column is the sort of the 5-tier system. The number of stars that I talked about earlier are going to be indicated here. The horizon is the horizon in which the investment is planned. So this may be different than the horizon that you submitted to us through your application. This is now a programming horizon. So this is our sort of positioning of your project within one of those 3 horizons from a financial standpoint. The grant is the predominant grant being used to fund that project. In many cases, it's the only grant, but in some cases there are some cost shares. Those tend to be on the shorter term projects, not the longer term projects. Where there is a longer term cost share or significant cost share, you'll notice that what we did is we just listed the project twice. So for example, we included a project for interstate and state route maintenance for TDOT that will be funded through NHPP and STBG. And we basically just predicted this into the future in terms of expenditure based on TDOT's current programming and our current tip. And so that's a conversation we need to have with them. But my point here is that you'll see that project listed twice, has the same ID, same project name. The only difference is because there's a significant cost share between two grant programs, we list it twice in order to make the accounting work. And then you see the horizon. This is the planned investment in federal dollars only. And then the federal YOE column is the sum of these three columns together. All of these are year of expenditure. And so embedded in this workbook are formulas that are inflating the base year cost, which is over here in the federal share column, by 4% a year, which is the inflation rate that we've been discussing regionally with the committee and the board. So we're growing base year cost to 4% a year to 2025, 35, and 45, and we assume that all projects happen in the mid-year of the horizon for financial planning purposes. Sean talked at length about this at the September 30th workshop, and we're happy to answer any questions, but we'll move on. So at the top of the list, we see the programmatic investments in light gray. The dark blue are the 5-star projects that I talked about. It's the corridor and downtown project that I mentioned on the slide, but it's also some of these programmatic policy investments like our active transportation program, transit technology program, the maintenance programs. These are in blue because they're a policy decision. We're taking an STBG grant or an NHPP grant and programming them by virtue of our policy towards those types of activities. The difference between that kind of programmatic investment and the ones above in gray are the ones in gray are grant-based programs, not policy-based programs. If that distinction matters to you, it may not. So that's the dark blue section are the regional projects, the 5-star projects. The dark red section are the TDOT projects that are 4-star projects. 4-star projects, remember, are those projects in programming history. So they're Improve Act projects that are in the TIP or TIP projects that have some history. So starting with this section, each of these subsequent sections are going to be sorted by project score, but we're only showing the tier. Okay, so the dark red are all the TDOT projects that are essentially in the TIP. And then the light are all the projects that were submitted by TDOT that are not in the TIP. So this would be their 3 and 2 and 1-star projects. And then the next section of projects are the local projects that have been submitted that are in the TIP. So these are the 4-star local projects sorted by score. And then the white section are the local projects currently not in the TIP. So these would be the 3, 2, and 1-star projects that are awaiting a funding decision from us that are locally driven. And then the last section is a dark gray section, which are projects that are not really being considered for itemization with STBG or NHPP based on the discussion we had on September 30th. So many of these projects are going to ultimately be funded by one of the programmatic categories that we mentioned earlier. So we will list them in the plan as candidates for the programmatic investments, but they won't be assigned grants from those programs. Okay, so let me stop there. I have just 1 or 2 more things to say about this list, but I've been talking for a while and I know I've gone through quite a bit. Let me see if there are any questions. Are there any in the chat, Sean, at this point? I don't see any. Okay. Any immediate questions just about, what's represented on the table before we start talking about implications. Okay, I know it's hard. Yes, sir, go ahead. Is that Glenn? Okay, I think I cut somebody off. If I did, I apologize. You can try again or just throw your comment or question in the chat, and then I'll look for Sean to read that out loud as I continue.
Okay, we have a question from Katrina Jones. Can you reiterate what the pink and light blue sections represent?
Pink and light blue, sure. So the let me say it this way: the shades of red are TDOT projects. The dark red are TDOT projects in the tip. So those are projects that are going to be prioritized for funding over projects not in the tip. And then the TDOT projects not in the tip are the light red or the pink. And then the light blue and the white projects are local projects. The light blue are the projects that are currently in the tip, and of course will be first in line for funding. And then the projects that are in the section colored without color, basically, it's not white, it's just the absence of any color. Those are the local projects not in the tip that will be. That's the remaining work that we've got to do, is start awarding money. And you'll notice, and this is really one of the things I was going to say next, your question leads right into it. You'll notice that the way to tell if a project has been recommended for an award is if there is a horizon year listed and a dollar amount and the horizon that's shown. So you'll see in this dark blue section, light blue section, which are the local projects currently in the tip, we've assigned the 2025 horizon and we have signed a grant. And largely speaking, this is SDBG only. There are a couple of examples. I kept the local, there's two relatively large Murfreesboro projects that were locally funded. I just didn't want to lose sight of those. And then there's an old ITS grant in Metro that's still on the list. And I didn't want to lose sight of that either, because that's a project that tends to be confusing through each iteration of the plan update. But by and large, you're going to see the horizon, and then you're going to see either an STBG grant or an NHPP grant in this column. And then you're going to see the dollar value of the investment in the horizon year that connects to this column. And again, this is going to be for 2030, 2035 and 2045, particularly, it's going to be 4% annual growth over the base year estimate. Hopefully that got your question, Katrina. Okay. Any other questions, Sean?
I think we also have one from Bill. Some projects were listed without projected costs. How will these be grouped, identified, and should projects now under construction be removed from the list?
Okay, so trying to find an example. Most of the examples of no projected costs are going to be up here in the programmatic, where that's just simply not applicable exercise. You don't know the projects for these. But Bill, if you have a specific case of where we're missing a cost estimate, that is likely an error, because I don't think we've intentionally carried forward. I see one right here, so we'll look into this one. And Sean may know off the top of his head. I don't happen to know what's happening with this 2697 project, but there shouldn't be any, Bill, that are not so that's not intentional. We'll need to address that, obviously. It may be missing, but it can't be missing at this stage. We have to come up with a number one way or the other.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Bill. There were several projects, I think, initial project cost estimates submitted. And so we'll be looking through those with the different cost estimation approaches that we discussed last week to generate a number for those.
Okay. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can. Clear.
I couldn't tell earlier. Uh, there's several new interchange projects on this list. I've gone through it pretty extensively, and obviously this list is even more refined. Um, are some of those interstate interchange projects, have they gone through some sort of interchange justification study? Some of them seem really close and may not meet separation requirements from existing interchanges. I just wondered if that's been looked into.
Bill, would you be referring to TDOT projects or local projects?
Uh, I'm not sure if they're just TDOT projects. I could identify them, but I don't want to spend much time right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to find interchanges in both the local submissions and the state submissions. I would suspect that the TDOT interchange modifications, which many are going to be like ramp modifications, not major redesigns or new. I'm going to suspect those are fairly well vetted, but we will double check for sure. And before anything gets into the tip, obviously that will have to be reconciled. For the local projects, no, sometimes, projects do get on the list before there's been, I don't know what the studies are called anymore. It used to be the IJS, the interchange justification study, then it was an IMOD, the interchange modification study, but that will certainly be a requirement before it can be programmed.
Okay. Just wondered if, that will eat up some of the funds if some of them aren't eligible. Little concern there.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, and I'm looking at the original list that was provided with the stars on it the last week or 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. And for whatever reason, the I-65 widening project, there's 2 or 3 of them that comprise that project. That's north from Goodlettsville up to the Kentucky state line. The bulk of the project seems to be project number 2841 and 2840 and 2833 all seem to be in the 4-star tier. But for whatever reason, that section between Goodlettsville or 31W and Highway 257 going up the ridge is assigned a 2-star. And I just wondered why that's popping out like that. I've mentioned that before, that those are kind of out of whack, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is the difference in the definitions here. So remember, 4-star projects are 4 stars because they have programming history, not because they necessarily scored well. And then anything not a 4-star or a 5-star, their number of stars is based on their score. And so what you have here is the sections that have already been programmed and perhaps some work has gotten underway. They're just put into they're just put into that second tier because the commitment is really already there to fund those projects. There can be exceptions if there's a sort of a lack of interest from the policy board or otherwise some kind of fatal flaw that requires that project to be reconsidered. That remains a possibility. But by and large, if a project has programming history from and a prior commitment in federal funds, we tend to stay with those projects, and we try to make them better projects. But we don't bail on those projects unless there's something it's no longer in good standing. So those other sections you mentioned are just the number of stars. Since they're not programmed, the number of stars is just how it's scored. The reality, Bill, is that that this is where our discretion in terms of the allocation of money comes into play, where we're not going to decouple those. Most likely, it's just not a chance of that. We're also not likely to not honor TDOT's request, because a lot of these projects are being driven by the Improve Act or more complex scheduling that is underway within TDOT. So, all of these, I wanted to group these all together because, if I was just sorting this list by tier, we would have seen the dark red and the light blue together. But, I'm elevating these TDOT projects not meant to communicate the likelihood that these are going to be honored, and it's just about trying to understand the scope of work, making sure it's consistent with our vision, and make sure we have good cost estimates and the right grant program assigned.
All right.
But we should never defer any responsibility or opportunity we have, though, to speak out on a state project that we don't like. I don't mean that in a critical sense, but the NPO process is designed to make sure that these federal funds are being used in a way that is consistent with the goals, objectives, and vision of the local communities within our metropolitan area. So we do ask that if there are any of these state projects that give you discomfort, that's something we need to be documenting and exploring further. For TDOT's benefit, one of the last things I'll say for TDOT's benefit, per conversations we've had with Preston Elliott, some of the I-24 projects have been grouped together into this Southeast Corridor project here. Particularly the projects that y'all had submitted that were sort of the bucketed sort of recommendations from the congestion study, and some of the longer term investments in that corridor for technology upgrades. Those were all bundled together and not itemized individually. I apologize, I cut somebody off. Let me come back to you. Okay, well, just let me know if there's any more questions in the chat. Sean, I can sort of bring this home here with a few more.
One more question, Michael,
Sure.
that kind of relates to what we were talking about. This one's from Rochelle, mentioning, I'll try and paraphrase, that some of the projects that are more conceptual that multimodal is commenting on within TDOT, examples include like State Route 6 widening project in Spring Hill, or State Route 386 in Gallatin. And as the design of those projects, as they advance through design and those details get negotiated, she's asking about how does the NPO account for those changes, since projects can change after they're funded?
There's two answers to that question, because there's sort of two altitudes to work with. One is that, what we want to do is, we're trying to demonstrate this through the staff assessments that are happening right now. We want to identify opportunities, just like you are, Rochelle, to incorporate multimodal accommodations where they're not mentioned in the description. And we're going to document that. We're going to document our recommendations for each of these projects in the appendix of the plan, so that they move with the project to programming. When we go to move a project into the TIP, we will check those notes as a reference point and make sure that we're having a conversation with the sponsor, including TDOT, to describe the project in the TIP in the best way possible. So that's one thing we're doing, and Sean can talk more about that. He covered that in pretty good detail at the September 30th meeting. But the other thing that I would address here is, how do we track it once it's being developed? And that is sometimes a challenge. We're not always looped in on communication about project development. We may get like a NEPA document when it's through the process and it's seeking concurrence, but sometimes we can lose sight of a project once it's sort of going through design and environmental review, and even into developing right-of-way construction plans. We need better mechanisms to make sure that the parties that were involved in deciding that project continue to be involved to make sure the project is getting built the way it was intended. So hopefully there's sort of two levels of that. I think you grasp this fairly well. So both of those answers probably make sense to you. All right, it's a really good question. Any others, Sean?
Just one comment from Tom Brashear to asking for a legend, color-coded legend for the document.
Yeah, happy to do that. And we'll, this is hot off the press, as you might imagine. We're really trying to get everything prepared for the policy board meeting in a couple of weeks. So we appreciate your flexibility with us. I mean, you really, at this point, really more of a part of the production team. So we need your eyes on this for quality control and to fill in missing details. For now, the color coding is in the footer of the spreadsheet, but what we will do is we'll do a cover memo that explains sort of what the list represents, what the columns mean, and what the color coding means. We'll do that properly. It just wasn't done for this morning. So thank you for the suggestion, Tom. All right, I need to run to another meeting here in a bit, but I do want to talk a little bit about where we go from here. So the budget sheet that I showed at the beginning of this handout is basically, it's reflecting the sum of the expenditures that you're seeing in the 20, 25, 35, and 45 columns, and it's summing it by the grant column up to the balance sheet. And so what you see here is we've got, just looking at the bottom line, we've got about $532 million left to allocate to projects. And I'll talk a little bit about how that will work in a second. But this number is going to keep changing. Every time we change the horizon for a project, it changes all the numbers because we're inflating cost each year of expenditure. So you push a project from the 2035 horizon to the 2045 horizon, we just cost ourselves a lot of money to do that. So every time we change our horizon, it's gonna change its balance. Every time we update a cost estimate or change a grant source, it's going to change these numbers. But based on the way it's allocated now, which is very provisional, we've got about $530 million left, but we are not balanced by horizon. So you'll notice that we go negative on the urban STBG after the 2025 horizon. So we've got to address that, either reduce the burden on STBG for those projects or shift some to 2035, which is going to be counterproductive because it's going to increase the costs. So we've got to deal with things like that. You also see NHPP is going well over budget by the end of 2035. It comes back into line by 2045. It's still negative, but it's less than the surplus that we have for the sort of the statewide SDBG. So those sort of offset each other. Most of the revenue we have left to allocate are the sub-allocated SDBG projects, which is where we should be because the NHPP and the statewide SDBG are largely driven by the Improve Act, the 3-year work program, and some of the programmatic stuff that we do with TDOT to make sure that things are accounted for. So in order to get like the rest of this 530 million, again, that number might change by 100 million or so just by changing horizon years, but just call it what it is, $530 million now. What we will essentially do, assuming everything is tight, in terms of the programming for any of the projects with a horizon year identified and a funding source, well, so just assume everything light blue and above is final, right? What we would do then is we'd start at the top of the white section here and just start going down and looking at each of these projects. And this is rank ordered right now. Now, the scores are also changing for a couple of reasons we'll mention here in a second, but we would just start at the top of the list. When we look at each project, we look at what was being asked for in terms of the dollar amount and what the schedule is that's being proposed. Some of these are being phases are being grouped together. But we would just start at the top of the list and start trying to allocate the remaining funding to as many projects as possible. Now, then we're going to go back and say, all right, we're taking a huge hit on, not to pick on Metro, but this Metro Public Works project is a whopper. $41.6 million is a lot of money for a project that's typically funded through SDBG sub-allocation. We might be able to do this, but we're going to go back to Katrina and Faye and say, which of these phases are the most important to you to move forward first, and we're going to try to cut that cost down so that we can spread the money out a little bit further, so it's not getting bottlenecked on a couple of these really long arterial corridor projects. Not to say they're not important enough, but that's sort of the give and take that we're going to be going through to make sure we can get the rest of that money allocated across the projects. But to do that give and take, we really rely on making sure that the information is complete, that we understand what's being proposed, that we have an open line of communication with y'all, and that we can do this in a timely manner. If there's any uncertainty about a project, we're probably just skipping over it, to be honest with you. We're just kind of out of time to figure out what's being proposed. If we're not sure, we're probably going to skip over it. Now, like I said, we've got until the final list won't be presented to the board until January after the state and federal review. So, it'll continue to change over the next couple of months. But by and large, the bulk of the money is now allocated. And we've got a little bit more work to do to get that SDVG identified on projects. And we also have a little bit of work to do with transit agencies to itemize the 5307 funds that we expect to see happening in the 2025 horizon. There are some transit projects that are funded in the color sections, and these are transit or greenway projects, which typically aren't in the mix. They're in the mix because they have a previous commitment of STVG or NHPP, so those commitments remain there. But new money going to those projects would have to come from the programmatic set-asides that we have, either the policy set-asides we talked about or the specific grant program set-asides that we have. They're not out of the running altogether. The funding source won't be locked in on that project until the subsequent call for projects occur. So in terms of next steps, Sean, go ahead and take the screen share back, and we'll throw up that last slide, and then I'll turn it back over to you to take any additional questions. I do need to run here in a second. Okay, so we can't stress enough, this list is subject to change through the state and federal review process. A couple of things are going to change this list are anytime you change a project scope or the details of its location, there's a ripple effect. I've mentioned the state and federal review comments are likely to impact our list. The qualitative assessments are near completion, but not all the way done. Again, those are hard to get done until we have full understanding of the project that you're proposing. So there are a few projects that still need our assessments to be complete. Part of the assessment does impact the score. Cost estimates are going to be updated as new information is made available. We're not going to ignore new information. We're going to incorporate that new information, which is obviously going to have a ripple effect across the balance sheet. And then we're also still waiting on some of you to identify your top local priority, which will then change the score of that project and position it in a better spot for funding. So there's just some moving parts that's still left. Not on the list is just general QC. There's just a lot. There are a lot of projects. We've come across projects that were the same project that we've merged or purged duplicates. We need to make sure we're not including money that's already been obligated. So that's another thing that we're going through. There's still some projects that don't have logical termini. Once those termini are reset, it's going to impact the cost estimate. So, we really got like a good week and a half, 2 weeks with y'all to get as much of that resolved as possible for the policy board. We want to give the state and federal government a really good, clean project list to be reviewing, so they're not worried about sort of the data quality issues at that point. So anyway, let's look at the next steps. Again, this is a provisional list. It will continue to change. We'll keep in the loop. If any of this stuff gives you heartburn or you don't understand what's being represented on the list for your projects, reach out to Sean and Anna. We'll get a meeting set up. Sometimes phone is better than email to work through these issues. But that's where our capacity is over the next week and a half, is to work with you on any of the remaining issues before we get to that October policy board meeting. So Sean, that's I appreciate the opportunity to run through that and all your efforts on this. I'll turn it back over to you, and I'm gonna I need to skedaddle.
Thanks, Michael. I think you touched on a lot of those next steps of details that we're finalizing. As Michael mentioned, we've been in touch with some of you, particularly Anna and I, and we'll reach out to the remainder of project proponents that we're trying to clarify some of the project details, logical termini on. As Michael mentioned, an important component will be verifying some of these cost estimates to make sure that they are reasonable, so that we can have a good, confident understanding and confidence in programming those project lists by the time horizons. One item that we touched on last week that reach out to the rest of you on who are in attendance today is that we're also looking for you to indicate your top local priority of the projects that you submitted. Looking for likely projects that you are the sponsor for and the lead on. And then we can take that into account as well as we finalize this list. I've heard from a couple of folks that indicated their priorities already, but that's another reminder item that we'll distribute to make sure that we can collect that information as well. Katrina, I see that you wrote, is there a deadline to provide the top local priority? The sooner the better. We would like to have that information as we go into the Transportation Policy Board meeting in 2 weeks. And so if you could get us that information by the end of the week, that would be great. But within the week, so that we could have it by next Wednesday, would also work for us. I think that's all for some of the remaining items. We'll continue to work with you on some of these. I think the staff qualitative assessments, as those factor in, there might be a little bit of back and forth as we relay those comments to you. I think the same thing applies for the cost estimates, where we'll let you know if we have updated numbers and get your comfort level with those before we proceed with any updates on that end. See one more question from Bill. Is the top local priority also include a TDOT project that is in the local area or a local project submitted by the local jurisdiction? So it could be either. I think based on the preliminary list that you saw today, if there is a TDOT project in your local area that you support and it's already indicated with 4 or 5 stars, I would advise kind of going down the list to your top local priority that you would be advancing to heighten the priority of that project. Does that address your question, Bill?
I think so.
Okay. Is there any other feedback or considerations that members want to relay before we move on from this topic?
Sean, Anna, this is Katrina. I may need to have a separate conversation with you all offline about Metro's priorities. So whenever you guys have some availability, maybe this week or early next week would be great.
Sure, that works, Katrina. We can reach out to you with some times. And if anybody else wants to, talk through this question, we're available. Okay, I think if there's no other questions on that topic, we'll shift gears slightly to talk about the tip, but I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for all that information from you and Michael on this upcoming update. I guess the next item on the agenda for today is the tip amendments, cycle A, and so it calls for cost overruns, and Anna Emerson will fill us in on this one.
Thanks so much, Glenn, and hello, everyone. We aren't reviewing proposed amendments to our TIP this morning, but we need to take some time to discuss our next cycle of amendments, which will be the first group for the new fiscal year, 2021. If you were with us in 2018, as most of you were, you may remember we held a special call for project cost overruns, where we provided the opportunity for members with projects that were experiencing overages in either right-of-way or construction phases to apply for additional funds to cover those overruns. We were able to identify funding by consulting with other members who had a project that either wasn't going to have a major chunk of funding obligated during the lifespan of the current TIP that we could push into a future TIP, or had a project that wasn't currently moving forward for one reason or another. So we were able to take that funding and provide it to a more pressing need and make assurances that projects that had money transferred off of their budget would be prioritized and replenished at the appropriate time. So for this upcoming amendment cycle, we're going to repeat that process in the hope of providing a vehicle for any current TIP projects that may be stalled due to lack of funding to proceed. So you may fall on one side or the other of this process, which could mean that either A, you might be contacted by our office to inquire about a specific project that has an amount of funding on a particular phase that isn't likely to be obligated in the near time frame, or B, you may have a need you want to submit to us via the application that's in a screenshot on the current slide. So know that if we contact you looking to discuss funding on a project that can be deferred to a later year, that's truly going to be a discussion where we're looking to get a fuller picture of where the project is and the delivery process and any considerations that are unique to that project's implementation. And if you're in the position where you're wanting to submit an application for additional funding, the two main criteria for that are going to be that, one, your project is programmed in the current TIP, and two, that the additional funds needed are either for the right-of-way or construction phase. We're not going to provide additional funding for preliminary engineering related to environmental work or project design. The application itself may look familiar as it's pretty much the same format we used in 2018. It's not too much for you to fill out, but it does give us some pertinent information in kind of an organized fashion. So just as a quick overview of what you can expect to see in that application, which we will provide to everyone via email during our usual follow-up to this meeting that we send out to everyone. It's just 2 pages. You can kind of get a glimpse of the first page there on this slide. It's just asking, who you are, what your project name is, what is its current TIP ID, and then there are fields you can fill out requesting what your needed amount is for additional construction funds or additional right-of-way funds. There's the second page to the application that just has a couple more questions related to whether or not the project scope is still the same and providing a brief explanation for any reason your cost overrun occurred. We are going to require 2 supplementary items in addition to the information that's on the actual application, one of those being documentation of your most current project cost estimate or bids received that exceed the total current program funds. And then the other is a letter of assurance regarding the availability of your required 20% local match should the additional funding that you're requesting be received. So we just wanted to give everyone a heads up about this process. Again, you'll be receiving a copy of this application shortly via our TCC email that will go out after the meeting. If anybody has any questions about the process, it's welcome to ask those here. If you think of something later, please feel free to reach out and ask me those questions. Sean, will you flip to the next slide real quick? So this is outlining the timeline for this amendment cycle. Most importantly, we're going to be asking that you submit any of these requests that you may have for project cost overruns by the 21st of this month. That's a Wednesday. That will give us enough time to kind of get things in line and prepare kind of the outlook on this process before we meet again at the beginning of November. So these amendments will go through our usual adoption process in November and December, with an expected adoption mid-December of these amendments. So that's what's going to happen with this cycle of TIP amendments. And like I said, if anybody has any immediate thoughts or questions, I welcome those. All right. Well, if nobody has anything, Mr. Chair, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for all of that information. We did have a question just pop up in the chat. It says, can construction overrun requests be applied to projects that are currently in construction?
Yes, they can. So if you're already in construction, you've experienced, a change order situation or an unexpected circumstance that has raised the cost beyond what you have programmed for the project, yes, that is an eligible reason to submit this application.
Thanks. That's a great question and great feedback. So if there are no further questions, we will move on to the next item, which is regular reports. I have nothing for the chair's report. And so it looks like we have a couple items for the staff report. Sean, will you be leading that one?
I actually don't have any immediate reports that come to mind. I think there were a couple of TDOT grants that the deadline was wrapping up at the early part of October, and I think, as today's presentation indicated, we're primarily all hands on deck on the regional transportation plan. So we'll be continuing to work with you all to flesh out these details as we prepare for the Transportation Policy Board meeting on the 21st.
That's great. So I guess our homework now is to finalize any project details that we have and identify our top local priority projects.
Yes, that'd be great. And if you'll notice, I will make a quick plug that a lot of the information that we've been working with and updating, we've managed to update a lot of those details onto the Apply app into the project forms. And so if you have an opportunity to go to the Apply app and view your projects, you'll see some minor updates on projects as we've fleshed out some of these details. And so feel free to continue to review that and look at any of the project level indicators that we have or project details.
Great, thanks. We'll go check out the Apply app and make sure that all of our projects are up to date. The next item on the agenda is other business. I don't know if anyone has any other business for the committee. Just bring it up now. Hearing none, I guess we'll adjourn this meeting until the November 4th, 2020 date. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.